I just graduated from the Wharton School with an MBA this year, and I recently joined Google. I'm currently part of the Google's ads business, working in strategy and operations. And before that, I was part of McKinsey, based in Shanghai, where I was primarily in the digital business. So I was part of Digital McKinsey, where I worked primarily with financial institutions and also automotive companies on IT and digital transformation and strategy. Happy to meet you all. I'll transition it to Audrey.
Hey everyone, I think Daniel has covered pretty much what I have to say. I've been part of McKinsey since the very starting of my career, and still part of McKinsey post B school. So basically, I think PowerPoint and like storytelling is pretty much what I spend all day, every day to do. So very excited to be here and share some experience and tips with you all. So without further ado, shall we jump into the context? Let me share my screen. So today, as Daniel has kicked us off, we are mostly going to be focusing on the presentation in business context. So we are about to cover 4 parts for the specific topic. So first of all, I will introduce you all to the structure and organization. So basically, how do we structure our entire presentation? How do we think about going about a presentation, and how do we organize our thoughts into an entire, completed presentation? I'm gonna cover that, and then Jiaxi is gonna share some tactical tips on the written material, like how to properly write your presentation, and then what's the difference between written communication versus oral communication. And then we're gonna cover some tips on charting and how to present data. And then we'll wrap it up by introducing some concepts and giving a final presentation. And as you can see, there's a structure in here. So basically, these 4 topics, like a house, the structure and organization of our thoughts and storytelling is basically the skeleton or framework of the house. But by adding more elements, by adding, precise writing and proper charting and data into it, we give it more and more color. And at the end of the day, it's all about how we present it by actually communicating it to our audience. Cool. So diving into our first topic today, which is to structure and organize our presentation. First off, let me start with an example. So basically, this is usually, I think it's within McKinsey, but also I think it is really, a framework that is useful in a lot of situations where we go about thinking about solving a problem, and then at the end of the day, look back at our process of thinking and, start about structuring our presentation. So usually we start with solving a problem by data and observations. So a lot of examples, this is an example about Monica. It can start with, okay, Monica lost her keys and he lost her passport, blah, blah, blah. However, she never missed a deadline at work. And she even won the most organized manager award. So these are the data and observations that we have about Monica. So then from those data and observations, facts we collected, what kind of summarize or insights we have about Monica. We can probably see from the data points I have collected so far about her, We can say that Monica is highly organized at work. However, she might lack this discipline in her personal affairs. This is the first step from, when solving a problem, we go from day-to-day facts to something that we summarize to a level that we kind of have this preliminary conclusion. And then we always ask ourselves, so what? So then now we know so much about Monica, but so what? What's the implications of my observations and my conclusion? So basically you can say, okay, Monica may need to cut down how much she works, and work may begin to suffer unless the underlying causes of her disorganization are solved. And those are the kind of what we want to do, like what we can do. So basically directionally, what we think we can do to improve what we observed. And then we ask ourselves one more time, so what? And then basically lead from this implications to a more actionable recommendation for Monica. So for example, we can say Monica should consider adjusting her schedule to create more time for non-work activities, and also she might benefit from providing extra support or getting extra support to balance the demands of work. And then from that, we can get to our final recommendation. So as you can see, this is just an example, but usually in real work, we always are faced with overwhelmingly amount of information starting from all the data and facts, and how we structure an effective communication is always, I think asking ourselves, so what, and doing more synthesize and summarize to the extent that we can draw a conclusive conclusion from the observation. That would be super helpful. And I think usually once we get to the level that we think we have a recommendation, that is the right point to start thinking about giving a presentation. And the things before that, usually we call it problem solving, basically is to know what we're solving for and collect enough data and facts and insights in order to reach to a conclusion. And I see a question coming up. How would you come up with implications that has high degree of belief? That's a great question. So usually when we're collecting data, like how data can be biased, and so it can be iterative process in terms of collecting data and then driving insights and thinking about implications. And usually what we do at McKinsey is what we call a hypothesis-driven approach, which is usually we go into solving a problem by having a hypothesis. It can be proven true or false based on the data we are about to collect and analysis we are about to do in order to test this hypothesis. And like once you have hypothesis 1, maybe you can test it and see if it's false or true. And then usually you can go a step further to test additional hypothesis that you can derive from this initial hypothesis. So it's usually a very, very iterative process until you get to the enough level of confidence to say about your conclusion. Hope that helps. All right. Let me go to the next slide. So here's a summary of what is the difference between facts and data, and summary and synthesis. So usually, especially as consulting, I think we always try to distinct synthesis from facts, because again, I think facts can be overwhelming. We can never exhaust enough amount of facts, just because we're living in this era of data and digital, and we always have more amount of data than we need. So facts is usually, things that is true, but it's not conclusive. Versus a summary can be a summary of the facts. However, the summary usually still doesn't tell you what to do. And synthesize is more kind of on a higher level than both facts and summary. And by synthesizing your findings, you should always be able to say, okay, what is the next step? What is the next actionable recommendation from this analysis and facts finding and the entire project you have done? So at the communication level, synthesizing is really important because in a business contact, when you're reporting to someone who is senior, usually they don't have enough brain bandwidth to digest whatever details in the data. I think the most important information they're looking for from your presentation is usually, okay, so what should my organization do in order to address the problem that you just mentioned in your presentation or follow the advice that you are recommending. So synthesizing things to the appropriate level and speak to your audience is usually kind of the testing bar to test whether your communication is good enough or not, or whether we're at the level to really speak to a more senior audience. And next slide. And how do we get there? So one kind of useful tactic that I've seen is usually what we call storyboarding or storylining, which is really just to, after you do a huge project, to think back and usually to put together a story that, it's very simple. It can be a few sentences, but that story should really be what you want to communicate to your audience. So how we can go about it is usually we can outline our written. And again, so storylining or storyboarding should always start before we start doing our PowerPoint slides or more detailed written communication, because after we've done our great work, we usually need some really time and headspace to really think about what is the right thing we wanted to communicate to our audience. So I would really recommend, before doing your presentations and doing your PowerPoint slides, just sit down and have a piece of paper in front of you, or maybe start with a Word documentation about the outline of our written presentation. And then those outlines will be the kind of the guidelines for our PowerPoint slides. So basically, each sentence will be what we call leading title of the final PowerPoint presentation. And then by adding those sentences or storylines together, you should be able to tell a full story, and the audience, by just reading your outline or your storyboarding, should be getting the key messages that you wanted to convey in this entire presentation. So this is just an example of how it could look like. So as you can see, when you're doing storyboarding, you usually start with a continuous set of sentences, and each of sentences should be a summary or synthesized level for your key message, and they together should be able to tell the audience about what you're about to say, and they will become the title of your presentation. And you might wonder, so when we're doing the storyboarding, how can we test whether this outlining or storyboarding is really at the level of how we can tell our story. So here is a famous concept. I believe it was invented by McKinsey company, which is called the pyramid principle. You might have heard about it, but it's not hard at all. But I think it's a very useful way to test your thinking when it comes to storytelling. So basically, at the top of the pyramid, it's gonna be your final recommendation or key message. And for the key message, usually you will have find the supporting build blocks or supporting arguments. So each of those supporting arguments can be either one slide or be a section of your presentation. And supporting arguments, they all add together should be a full set of arguments that can fully support your final introduction and key message on the top level. And for each of the supporting arguments, we will have other evidence. It's either it's data or analysis or other facts that we have found. So each of these piece of data should be connected to one of supporting arguments, and they all together should be able to support the supporting argument. So you can see why we call it pyramid principle. It's because it really looks like a pyramid. So it's like if you think about maybe a wardrobe, and and each of the supporting argument can be different layers of drawers. So if you look at this wardrobe as an entire thing, it's just one piece of furniture. But if you open it up, and if you open like one door from the wardrobe, you will find an extra layer of structure, extra 3 pieces of data that actually is included and be supportive of your subsection or arguments, and they all together will add up to a fully structured communication to support your key message. And there are 2 ways of thinking about this pyramid. And when you're doing the storyboarding, you can write it from top down. So basically you can start with the big idea. So what do I want to tell my audience? I wanted to tell Monica that she need to start thinking about balancing her work and life. Then I would always ask myself how and why and what. And by asking myself how and why and what, I go deeper and deeper into the context to the level that I reach the most granular details of the presentation that I wanted to show. And then that's what we call top-down thinking, basically breaking things down into more granular levels. And we also have what we call bottom-up. You can start by the most detailed analysis that you have done. And from that analysis, we can always ask ourselves, so what? And so by asking ourselves, so what, we are doing summarizing and synthesizing. And then by doing multiple layers of summarizing, synthesizing, we can get up to the level where we can say, okay, this is the one final piece of large recommendation and that I wanted to tell my audience. If I wanted to tell my audience one thing from this presentation, then what is it? So basically getting from the detailed data to our key message. And here's an example. So starting with the facts, I can tell you all kinds of facts about pigs. Pigs never get sick. Pigs have rolling curves of fat. Pigs have sweet breath. Pigs live in the garden. Pigs form small tongues. Pigs eat leftovers. I don't know if you guys want to volunteer, but if I tell you those 7 things about pigs, what do you think you can get away from it? Let me cold call or other speaker, Jiaxi?
Well,
What
I
do you
think
think of those?
if I just read about these, I won't be able to take away any conclusion because this is just a random collection of facts about these.
Exactly. So what was my point? I had no point because I just told you like a few random things about this lovely animal, but I didn't say anything about them, and you won't take anything away from it. However, if I just use the pyramid structure to try to structure my communication about pig, just now, how would I do it? So basically, let's say I'm testing whether having a pig would be a good choice of, whether having a pig will be a good choice for petting. And then by structuring my 7 random arguments together into 3 different arguments, I would say, oh, they're beautiful because the supporting evidence that they have rolling curves of fat, they're deep soulful eyes. And then the second point will be they're cheap because they eat leftovers and never get sick. And the third supporting argument will be they're great kissers because they have sweet breath and small tongue. And then if I look at my 3 arguments together, they're beautiful, they're cheap, and they're great kissers, then I will support my conclusion that I want to get a pig as my pet. So as you can see, that is an example for the pyramid structure. Basically, everything that we do in our presentation, they should find a place. You need to first identify which layer of the pyramid this piece of information should live, and which argument the piece of information should support. And then they all together should be supporting the one final takeaway you want your audience to remember. And with that, I hope you would remember a couple of things from structuring the presentation, and then we'll talk more. Jiaxi will talk and tell us more about how to write a good presentation.
Cool. Thanks, Audrey. So, I think now that we have learned a little bit about how we can, organize our presentation in a fashion that tells a compelling story, I think now it's a good time for us to deep dive into, some of the tactical approaches we can take to make our message, even more clear on a page-by-page basis. So if we go to the next slide. All right, so I think just to go into the next slide, I think one important takeaway here is, we want to tell a coherent story with a clear storyline. So I think one of the best practices that personally helped me a lot in the past is before I come up with the actual slides and the actual content within the slide, I usually take a step back and think about what is the overall storyline that I want to tell, and I use whether it's a piece of paper or a Word document just to write down like dot dash in terms of what are some of the key messages I want to communicate. So I might start with a simple background. For example, if I wanted to tell a story about or I wanted to convince my stakeholders to, for example, invest more in a specific business line, I might want to start with a document that lays out the overall storyline. So I might start with, what is the background that we need to invest in this specific business? First of all, we might have seen slowing sales in other businesses, and we might have seen other macroeconomic trends that might impact how we want to focus on different areas. And then I would transition into, for example, what are some of the options out there? And then I would compare and contrast different options, which would be my second part of the story. And then moving on, I would potentially deep dive into the specific business that I wanted to promote in here, and show the data that's available that would support my argument. So translating that into, what is how I approach starting with the slide is to write the dot dashes in terms of the actual recommendation, the actual conclusion I want to draw from this slide, instead of just writing a description of what's on the slide. So one example of that would be, instead of saying, this is an overview of the background as your slide title, I think it might be more helpful just to replace that with something that calls out your story. So for example, the macroeconomic background, the growth in that specific sector calls us for more attention in that sector, rather than showing the overall, writing overall in this trend, quote unquote, in the actual slide. So I think that's going to help you structure your message much better, and also make it much more efficient when you want to come up with the actual content to support your message. I think there was a question about why the message line is better. I think one important benefit of that, as Audrey has previously mentioned, is that when we do exec presentations, many of these folks have very short attention spans, so they actually won't go through over every single detail on your slide. The one thing that they actually do look at is the slide title. So I think if we put the most important message in the slide title, first of all, it makes our message clearer, and number two, in situations where we don't have enough time to go through every single detail, it saves us time and makes sure that we get the entire message through rather than being stuck on one point. So if we can transition to the next point. So I think another mistake that I made when I was just starting to write slides, I think in high school, is I tried to put in everything onto the slide. So I still remember that, my first presentation that I did with PowerPoint, I did not put in any charts. I did not put in any pictures. I just literally wrote what I was going to say, line by line on the slide. And I was quite proud of it because I filled out the entire page. But unfortunately, looking back on it, I just realized that wasn't the right approach. So I think what the purpose of the slide is really to summarize the message you want to get through, and the key supporting facts you want to list out there. I think the purpose of the slide serves as a way to help you structure what you want to say, instead of literally acting as a guide on line by line on what you are going to talk about at the meeting. So I think one important takeaway is just put the most important messages out there on the slide, and maybe have a plan offline on how you want to frame it as you speak during a meeting, and also make sure you plan out for any potential questions coming from the audience and how you want to respond them tactically. Because I think in my experience, in many of the presentations that I have been part of, there will be questions about specific parts of the slide, and you might have to adjust on what message you'll voice out when you speak. And if you put everything that you were going to talk about on the slide, that's not going to work, because it's probably not going to answer the question that comes up. So I think another good way to help you really structure the message and use your slide to your benefit is also to have a plan beforehand. Just as a quick rehearsal, just going through every single slide, is something that I usually do, and think about what are the key messages I want to get through, and what are some of the things that I need to talk about on this slide, and what are some of the things that I can deprioritize. If there's time, I can talk about it. If there isn't any time, I can probably summarize it in an email afterwards and send it to the stakeholders. So there was a question about if there's any specific techniques about tailoring the messages to the audience. I think this is a very relevant question to to many of us. I think the most important thing to determine what message you're actually going to say during a meeting is to have a meeting before the meeting. So just to understand, who is coming to the meeting, and based on their experience working with that person, what are some of the questions they are potentially going to ask, and what are some of the things that they care most about. So for example, if I were going into a presentation with a cross-functional team, and for example, and if I work closely with, maybe some of the regional teams, they might care more about, what's happening in their own region rather than what's happening at a global level. And in cases where, I see someone who is coming to the meeting that I have never worked with or have never talked to, I would recommend grabbing time with that person beforehand, having a one-on-one or a smaller meeting, just to understand. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, cool. So I think I would recommend just grabbing time with that person if you don't know them that well before the meeting, just to understand, what they're working on, what they're coming from, and maybe highlighting some of the key parts of your presentation to gauge their initial reaction. And if if they have any, constructive questions or feedback about the message that you were about to take into the meeting, you can probably discuss that, at that time as well. And that actually helps you to really, make your presentation, much more inclusive in terms of the different viewpoints, as well as make it more efficient. So you don't have to address that issue during the actual meeting where you have probably 10 plus attendees. Cool. Hopefully that answers your question.
And I just wanted to build on your points, Jiaxi. I think that's very well said. And this one thing I remember from one of a McKinsey partner is that he said basically the final meetings should be used to reach alignment, and all the work should be done before that final meeting. So usually, aside from have meeting before meeting, we also can send out pre-reads. So basically ask our audience to raise any questions or concern before the meeting, so then we have time to address them. But really, if we wanted to have a meeting with a broader audience and make it successful, that meeting should really be used to reach the final agreement among different parties.
Cool. I think we can move on to the next part. I think one, just adding on to the previous point, which was writing our presentation. I think we just covered, how do we want to structure our key message? But at the same time, equally important is, what are some of the supporting facts that would go into making our point clear? And I think that's where I think in many cases where data comes into play, because that is something that's that would really shape the story by itself. So I think when we present data on PowerPoint slides, I think it's actually very challenging to make a very neat presentation with a lot of data. So I think I would say the number one principle is to make sure that the data is simple and highlighted on your slide. So how that translates into how you build this slide, I think again it would be really helpful just to take a step back and think about what are the messages you want to get across with that one slide, and selectively pick data that would support your argument. So you might have a huge data set with tens of thousands of lines of data. I think at that point it's important for you to think about if I wanted to get my message that, for example, sales are declining and that we need to invest in a different business, then we will probably selectively show the decline of sales in that specific business, rather than showing the entire data set where we have all of the sales data from month to month, day to day in different regions. So I think one thing, how that translates into the slide is I would potentially envision maybe a simple bar chart that summarizes revenue from last year versus revenue from in this year, and highlight maybe highlight the revenue in this year as red and point it out, it's declining by X%. And I think the next slide would probably be a double click into revenue for this year, and I would point out most of the decline is coming from this specific business, which supports my argument that we should move out of that business. And I could also selectively show that revenue is actually increased for another business that I want us to get into, and that actually would help support my argument that we would get into that other business. So I think the key message here is just to keep your data simple. Instead of throwing your entire Excel spreadsheet on there, make sure that you select the most relevant data. Yeah, so I think again, just thinking about the audience in exact presentations, most of the folks who are coming to such a presentation probably won't have any insight on the specific data set that that I have been working off of. So I think one thing is to, which ties back to Audrey's point, is we need to synthesize on the data point as well. So how we want to synthesize with the data is, I think one tactic, as I already mentioned, is to keep it simple and select the data that matters. And number two is just thinking about the best way to present your data, because there are different forms that we can present the data in. We can use bar charts, bubble charts, pie charts, you name it. I think we need to select the type of chart that makes the message the most crisp. So say, for example, if I wanted to maybe present a breakdown of revenue by product or by business, potentially I might just want to use a bar chart or a pie chart to show that. But say, for example, if I wanted to highlight, the distribution of, like different performance metrics for the business, including revenue, including profitability, including all of that, I might think about a timed bar chart where I show the trend in terms of last 3 years ago, 2 years ago until this year, and showing the bar charts on top of that as part of the revenue, and showing maybe a bubble at the bottom that shows the profitability, and use the different color scales to to really highlight where we have higher profits and where we have lower profits. So I think just mentioning a concrete example on how we can improve on a specific presentation slide with data. So on this slide, as you can see, we have a chart that I would say potentially shows the profitability across different product areas. So maybe let me pass it over to Audrey just to provide a couple comments on what do you think about this slide?
Well, so from this slide, it's very hard for me to tell why from reading this chart can I tell product 2 is not profitable. And also, by the way, I also don't know what can I do if product 2 is not profitable, but that's a minor point. I think the main point is it's just so hard to see, and I don't know which line or which number to read. Nothing is highlighted, and there are 4 products here, and I just don't know where to look at.
Yep. So I think you hit the point. I think this slide, I'm not sure what the message, whether the message is trying to get through is reflected on this actual chart, because I think first of all, how this chart is set up, it's not readable, given that first of all it lacks a legend in terms of I see different colors for different bars, but I don't know what each color means. And secondly, I think it lacks detail in terms of it's not consistent in terms of how it presents numbers. For example, in the gray chart and the lighter blue chart, the bars, they have specific dollar amounts tied to it, but in the last bar in each product, there is no number, so I won't be able to tell, what that actually is. And number two, I'm not sure about, what the numbers here stand for, because for example, the title says product financials, but I'm not sure, what the financials actually are, whether it's revenue, is it profit, is it cost? So I'm not sure. So I won't be able to draw the conclusion that product 2 is not profitable just by looking at this chart. So thinking about ways to improve, specific ways to help improve this chart with the toolkit that I just mentioned. So as we can see here, first of all, it's just making sure that we have a chart that's consistent, which means that we want to make sure that we have a legend that clearly lays out what each bar means. And number two, we want to make sure that everyone is aligned with the definition of the data that we're presenting. So clearly laying out whether this is costs in thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, and also making sure that we put all of the relevant numbers on there, which is we need to put numbers on the last bar as well. I think one thing that I always try to make sure while I was working consulting is making sure that we have a source. Because in many cases, I look up third-party data and maybe on the internet or maybe from an expert call. So I need to make sure that we have a clear source to backtrack into, because I think that's going to help us, later down the road when we want to diagnose, if there is something that people disagree with on the data point, we can go back and check, where we got the data from, and whether it's a source issue or whether we can cross-check multiple sources that we, to make sure that we got the right thing. I think there was a question about what are some of the things that we can do to improve or to make sure that we come up with like a fluent speech, off the cuff. That's a great question. I think we do have a section about the actual presentation part, so we can save that one to the next section. And if there's still a question about it, we can go back to it. All right. So I think this is just another version of the previous slide that you just saw. So I think with all of the improvements that I just suggested, this looks to be a much better chart in terms of presenting the key point. I think one thing to call out here is I think while I was working consulting, one common technique that was employed is using a box similar to the box you see here around the dollar values in product 2. We typically use that type of box to highlight the key area on the chart that we want the audience to focus on. I think there are some other cases where one slide is not enough to explain the full story, so we potentially have to double click into a part of the chart. So say for example, if we have already anticipated questions from the audience about why is product 2 not profitable, I would envision adding another slide that explains why it's not profitable. So I would add another legend on top of this chart that says, we will have a double click on product 2 on the next slide, where I would explain why it's not profitable. I think this is just we can just quickly go over this one. This is just another example of a chart that's not as clear. So I think in this chart, first of all, again, I don't see how it's supporting the key message, which is player 1 is consistent improving, even though we could see, that the blue chart, which represents player 1, is, going up in games 1, 2, 3, and 4. But again, I think, first of all, I'm not sure by what standards we're measuring player 1 at. Maybe this is just by the score that the player gets, or maybe it's just by the time that they play. It says RBIs in Little League. I'm not sure, maybe as someone who is not familiar with the game, what RBI means. So in this case, I would recommend just writing out what RBI stands for, assuming that this would be a score that highlights player one is steadily improving. But at the same time, I think another point to make is in this type of chart, you also want to be careful on how you segment and slice and dice the data. Maybe they just slice and dice the data in a specific way that supports their argument. So if I were an audience, I would potentially ask, by what definition are you measuring player one's performance? Maybe you are just cutting off the points that they gained in the first minute, which is not representative of the entire game. So I think always have the full data in your back pocket, just in case someone asks to dive deeper about the data. Well, so this one, makes it much more clearer, as we just mentioned, I think similar to the previous example, which is highlighting the actual thing you want to show. In this case, we're graying out the players 2 through 4 and really highlighting, that player one is improving, assuming that the data is what we were trying to present. Yep. I think the other part about looking at data is the data itself needs to tell a coherent story as well. So typically, I think one good approach that I learned from consulting is sometimes even when the chart is a little bit more complex. For example, this chart, it not only shows the absolute numbers of connections in terms of machine-to-machine connections in the US, but it also tries to show how it's growing and what the forecast is like. So just by looking at this chart, I think different people might come up with different conclusions. So say, for example, as a pessimist, I might conclude that we're still in very early stages today. There's still a long way to go. But as an optimist, I might see this as there's a lot of potential to grow. I mean, the forecast is growing extremely fast. There must be a lot of opportunities in the future. So I think you want to guide the audience on how to look at the chart. And the way to do it is to add a takeaway box next to the chart with your key message. And in this case, as you can see here, they added 2 bullet points to the right of the data to help the audience just to translate the data into takeaways. And in here, they just wanted to highlight that the revenue growth opportunity is huge, which is consistent with what they have in the slide title. Again, this is just a more in-depth example of what are some of the specific things they did right here. So happy to dive deeper into additional examples if there's questions at the end. But before that, let's jump into where you had questions about, which is actually delivering your presentation.
Okay, let me just cover, I think those are like really good questions because, I think about that constantly too. So let me just go over this presentation and let's come back to those 2 great questions raised by Julie and Ta. Okay, so here's a framework where I think there are 3 very important concepts for us to understand in order to deliver our presentation to our audience. So what are they? Basically, you can think of those 3 things as 3 levers or 3 tools that you can leverage in order to enhance your communication or presentation. So the first one is, let's start with, I don't really have a favorite one, so let's start with ethos. So what is ethos? Basically, it's the intelligence and trustworthiness and morals of your presentation, and really it's of you. I mean, at the end of the presentation matters, the written communication matters, but when it comes to a bigger meeting, when you as a person is presenting your ideas, what matters is you and the, what you stand for, and how can you present yourself so that you can be trusted and all the efforts that goes into the presentation can be most appreciated. So that's ethos. The second concept is pathos. Pathos is, really what we call soft power. It's really how you can emotionally connect with your audience, how you're liked by them. Is there any prejudice or like what is your audience motivation to listen to you? So that's kind of soft part, the ability to connect with audience, not only on intellectual level, but also on a more emotional and personal level. That's what we call pathos. And the third is logos, basically how solid your thinking or data or your entire analysis is. So basically logos is really about logic, evidence, data, universal truth that you can leverage to support your presentation. So those are the three things, we also call it smart power, soft power, and hard power. Logos is smart power, pathos, soft power, and ethos, sort of kind of hard power. So those are the things that we can do to enhance our presentation. And if you have one of them, that's great. And but I think in general, if you have all three of them well prepared, then it's guaranteed to be a successful presentation. So here's just some more examples to help us understand what is those three things, and then I will come back to those questions. I haven't forgot about them. So basically ethos, it's if you hear from your doctor that you should clean your tears because it's your doctor, it comes from your doctor, someone you trust on this particular area, so then you should listen to him so that you probably will follow his advice. Pathos, basically anything that connects to your emotional. So if you want to look good and stop worrying about your appearance, then you probably should think about cleaning your teeth as well. And then logos, it's statistical data supported why you should clean your teeth. All right, so let's come back to the question in the chat. The question really is, what are the things we do on a regular basis to improve the ability of making fluent, cohesive speech in English off the cuff? Great question, because I mean, I don't have a perfect answer for that, because things, apparently you can still hear that I still have glitches in my speeches. But one thing that I find really helpful is really to become less self-conscious, conscious, because knowing that English is also not my native language, and just have the confidence about myself and about my ability to convey the information to a group of native speakers helps me a lot. So I've had meetings where I was thinking about, okay, so like what is the best English word to use in order to say this or that? That didn't help me. Instead of that, I usually find that when I am more concentrated on the actual context that I want to say or actual impact I want to drive, the actual alignment or agreement with this group of people, I usually do better. So I think, and I think that is one thing. I know it sounds fluffy. Jiaxi, you probably have better ideas. But for me, I think it's really just the confidence in your work and what you present instead of your ability of language. Just don't let that concern actually constrain your actual performance in presentation. And also, I listen to my coworkers a lot, and I usually use a tactic called mirroring. So I usually like mirror their words. So whatever they're saying, I would, I would tend to use exactly same term as they're using to describe the same thing. I think that just helps to build some connection and rapport with your audience by using like mirroring their language. That also helps me as a like non-native speaker as well. Jiaxi, do you have anything you want to say about the first question Julie mentioned?
I think Audrey, you mentioned most of the things I could think about. I think maybe a couple things that I could add here is, I think preparation still matters. I think even though you don't want to say, exactly whatever you wrote on a slide or on a page, I think it still matters for you to really understand what are the key points you want to get across during a meeting, and make sure you stick to that plan beforehand. And again, tying back to my previous point about learning who will be part of the meeting is also important. I think just catching up with them before the meeting and offline allows you to really understand, what concerns and what potential questions they might have about the content. So you will be better prepared to answer any of the questions that come up, and you will be able to prepare for unexpected questions as well.
Cool. And then I think we can go to the next question, which is, do you have any advice on how to answer unexpected questions during presentation concisely and to the point? I think there's a few techniques that you can use depending on the situation and also on your audience. So I guess there's a way to basically cut off the question if in your best judgment that question is irrelevant or will derail the conversation, then you probably can just simply say, okay, or it's covered in the future slides, like 2 slides away from where you are. Then I think you can probably just say either, okay, I will cover in the next section, and if I don't, please just raise it again, and or you can say I'll come back to this, or you can say we will answer it at the end of presentation if of course if the audience is your senior manager, and you need to use that tactic depending on who they are and the actual situation. But I think it's totally legit just to, if the question is not relevant and unexpected and will derail the real message you want to say, it's totally legit to just put it at the end of presentation. And otherwise, I think there's a couple ways you can try to avoid this kind of situations, like Jiaxi mentioned, by knowing your audience. So I think there are like 2 types of unexpected questions. One is asking for more evidence. Basically, if you're saying where I should do this, and like the audience will be saying, why should we do this? And like, can you give me more evidence? In that case, you can probably, I think will definitely help if you can have the meeting before the meeting with them beforehand, or send out the pre-read. And if you don't have enough time to answer the detailed question in the meeting, you can just say, okay, it's in the pre-read that I shared with you before. Or you can just say, I will follow up with you after the meeting to go through more details. That's totally fine as well. And the second type of question is probably asking more details about the in-depth analysis that you're doing, or asking, so like, what is the conclusion? In that case, I think the pyramid communication should help. So basically, if your slide is structured in a way that that actionable title support is the synthesis of your key message on the slide, and if you put a summary page in front of the entire presentation and just to walk through the entire conclusion with the audience, that could help in there as well. And Jiaxi, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I think just to add to Audrey's previous points, I think if the question is not relevant, I would say just just you can simply respond that this is not probably not the best time to discuss, and then we can discuss it later. If the question is relevant though, and you do have the resources to help answer the question, I think I would try to stick with the facts as much as possible. I think you can let them know, based on this data, it shows, based on X data, it shows Y. And I think sticking to facts as much as possible, I think is a great tactic, just in case if, you don't know why they're asking the question. They might want to, use your response to, ask some other questions following up that you might not be able to answer. By sticking to facts, nobody can argue with facts. So I think that's one principle I would probably stick to.
Awesome. And with that, I think we can open up the Q&A session, Daniel, because I think we're done with our presentation. Thank you all so much for sticking with us. And I see a couple more questions in the chat. So let's just do the Q&A.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, so we have also a couple questions we collected from the survey, I guess when people first sign up. So there's a list of questions that we kind of break it down from storytelling, putting the deck together, and then content delivery. So I think before we jump into the Q&A, maybe just quickly address, I think there's quite a few questions you guys already discussed, like predicting what's important to the audience at different level. The meeting before the meeting, what Jiaxi recommended, I think a lot of them are very relevant, so we can skip quite a few. I think one thing specifically that stands out, especially for this crowd, is that most people came from engineering and tech background, whereas our audience from the presentation came from business, right? So how do you kind of consciously make the decision to, or I guess try to engage an audience from the business background and try to maybe not the right phrase, but dumb it down to the business. Kind of dumb it down so that people understand your slides, without having to dive too deep into the technical aspect.
Yeah, I can try to answer that question because I'm currently actually doing a quite technical project, but my audience is quite, from business end. So I think what really helps is really understand your, cliche again, but really understand your audience. So understand what they care about, because I think the biggest misunderstanding or miscommunication between the tech and business end happens when you guys don't speak the same language and you guys focus on different KPIs and your attention is just put into different areas. So I think one thing for the technical team, you guys can do is really to understand that particular business team, what problem are they trying to solve and what are their biggest concerns. So basically, why are they looking into this technical details that you're working at? How would that help them? So I guess just by understand their biggest concerns, you probably can, tailor your communication a little bit to speak really to the problem they're trying to solve. Because I understand that there's an overlap between the technical and the business team, but you guys are usually solving slightly different problems. So really speaking to the problems the business team is trying to solve would probably help, and also lead with actionable titles, lead with conclusions, and then before diving into any technical details, it is really important just to level setting, where we're at, where we're looking into this, what this solve, what problem, what this specific technical details solve, before diving into the technical details with them.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's very helpful. And then the last two questions, I'm going to kind of bundle things together a little bit. So not every PowerPoint slide or not every storytelling session is going to be conclusive, right? So if we don't get the results that we wanted, or maybe the result doesn't look great, how do you put together a story? And then I think on a similar note, if your result runs contradictory to some of your original hypothesis, or if it kind of points out a story where it might lead to a conflict of interest. Imagine, as a McKinsey consultant, you might be invited to some of those discussions about, hey, your team is not doing the right job, or maybe some of your team member, you need to come out and take those responsibilities. Now, how do you deliver those messages?
Jiaxi, do you want to take
I can take a stab at it. I think first of all, I think the first step before putting together any data analysis or slide together, I think one source of potential conflict or disagreement is different definitions of the data. So I think before actually diving into the analysis, I would strongly recommend that you align on how do you define what type of data you are going to look at. So for example, if you are going to analyze revenue growth, I think it's important for people to align, how do we define revenue? Is it revenue that we actually received, or is it recurring revenue that we will expect to receive next year? Or we should also align on, for example, what's the period of revenue that we want to look at? Is it this year, last year, or 3 years ago? Because depending on the definition of the data you look at, you might come up with different conclusions, which might lead to different confusion or disagreement if it's not well aligned with other teams. So I think that's the number one step I would recommend. I think number two, I think if you actually did the analysis and the data doesn't show any promises of your initial hypothesis, I would do probably two things. One thing is to look at how I slice and dice the data and see, if I can maybe slice and dice the data in a different way that would partially support my argument, and also look at the source of the data. Maybe the source is not what I was looking for. So cross-checking the data with multiple sources to make sure that I'm getting the right results. I think even after all of these steps, and even then, if you don't get any support from the data that you have, I would recommend, I think it would point to maybe I would pivoting your initial hypothesis to a different point. Or if if it results in a tough message that you need to deliver, I think make sure that you catch up with the key stakeholders again first offline, and make sure that they digest the message, and just explain what the situation is, what data you looked into, what's the definition of the data, and get their input on why this might be the case. If it's possible that they were looking at this data in a different way, or they were looking at different source. But if it's really really just, if the fact really is that that you have to deliver the top message, deliver it offline first and get the reaction. If the person that you are trying to talk to is extremely senior, I think maybe start with their team members first and then work your way upwards.
Very good.
And just one more point towards the conflict of interest question. I think it's always up to you to decide which piece of information do you show in a presentation. And also, if you're running the meetings, it's totally up to you to decide who should be in which meeting. So like if you think you're hurting some internal teams, then I think just some thoughtful planning around which meeting happens in what sequence, and then who should be in which meetings would matter a lot.
Okay, very good points. Let's move on to the next section, which is the putting the deck together. I think you already touched on a lot of grid visualization, so I think we can skip quite a few of them. And I also touched on the Q&A session, how to prepare for these. I think those are great suggestions. I think one of the question that comes up that also kind of surprised me and didn't give too much thought is, we're talking about answer first, right? So from McKinsey, from BCG, we want to put an executive summary on page 1 and put all the conclusions together. At the same time, we also talk about maybe setting up the plot and the conflict and then tell the story at the end. So how do you balance the two? Would you want to give out all the answer on slide 1, or would you want them to wait and read through your story first?
Yeah, I think that really depends on your audience. I can tell an example of cultural difference in that end. So for example, Americans in general, usually they're more kind of answer first type of mind versus I think in a lot of European culture, especially German, just speaking in general, they tend to drill much more into the details and would ask 10,000 whys. So it might work better for them just to set up the plot and conflicts first. I think in general, I think in business settings, people have, again, like very short attention span, and it's, my very limited experience, I think, I would always favor the answer first approach, unless if you think the things you're presenting, the plot and conflict is so interesting, it's as interesting as maybe an action film, then maybe it's worth it. I don't know, like, what's your opinion, Jiaxi?
I think it depends on how well aligned the answer is. If the answer is if you have already met with everyone before and they are, all agree and are aligned on the answer, I would go with the answer first approach. But if it's a controversial topic and if not everyone is aligned, I would, try to set it up with the context, with the background, and with the logic that's required for people to digest your answer.
Okay, awesome. And then the last part of the slides here is talking about the delivery of content. I think you talk quite a bit about the ethologos and pathos. I think those are great persuasion skills. And then I think when it comes to, how do you control the presentation time? I mean, especially your audience. So I think you also answered some of those. So maybe if you have additional things you want to address or maybe add on to it. Also, like when it comes to the presenting of the slides, how to strike a balance between what you reading out, what you see on the slide, compared to what you just speak out, irrelevant to the slide, right? There's two extremes. I've seen some professor at Wharton School showing just slides with a picture and then just completely go off on his own, right? And that's the one extreme. The other extreme is you just go kind of bullet by bullet, going off the slides, exactly where it is. So any comments on that? What's your style and how do you strike the balance?
I think just to answer, how we strike a balance between, the slide content and what I talk about. I personally prefer to be on the more simple side on the slide, because I think almost nobody is going to read everything on the slide, within the time that, that we talk about it. With that being said, though, if there is a really complex concept or complex calculation you want to highlight, I would have two sets of slides. One slide is basically showing a high level, maybe a flow chart or something on your logic. And the second slide, maybe double clicking on that logic with a concrete example that you walk through.
Awesome. Okay. And then the final question related on the panel discussion side is, challenges as unique to our current time, right? So where everyone is working remote, and all you're delivering your content, your slides remotely to your clients, and there is no there is no eye contact or maybe body language as you can read off their facial expressions. And then so how do you how do you address that conflict? How do you address that challenges?
Yeah, so I still do read their at least facial expressions just to get a sense of, how people are feeling. And another thing I find helpful is just to, have more interactive conversations. So plotting questions to your audience or anything to get their reactions, that I think is super helpful. For example, I think Zoom has a function to do like polls and survey in real time. Or you can just, ask questions to your audience, or even maybe cold call people to make sure it's still interactive.
Okay, that's good. Good point. So I think at this point I'm going to wrap up the maybe the panel discussion session. So let's turn back to the questions, the Q&A question, free-form question that people can ask in the chat box. So I think there are a couple ones already, and if you haven't asked a question, feel free to do so now. I think we have roughly 10 to 15 minutes left. So first one came from Ying Shen for Jiaxi specifically. So can you please share what are the similarities between, or maybe differences too, that you learned between the McKinsey role and also at Google? So I think we chatted, briefly before the discussion, but if you can kind of shed more lights on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I think if putting that in the context of this workshop, I think just from a communication / meeting presentation perspective, I think there are some important differences in terms of McKinsey and Google. But I think I also want to maybe clarify first that McKinsey, the projects are extremely diverse. We could get a very high level strategy project, or there are some operational projects day to day. So there isn't a clear bar to compare against when we talk about McKinsey. But I think just judging generally, I would say that overall, McKinsey, the way that McKinsey presents and communicates, I think it's more top down in terms of there's a lot of big picture storylining, simpler slides, and overall more focus on the actual story and hypotheses. Whereas at Google, for example, I think people focus a lot more on data. So how that translates into how we communicate is a lot of the communication is extremely data driven, and many of our slides I think would be much busier or more complex at Google, where we show actual data sets and data tables on the actual slide to make a point. Because I think one impression that I have is that even senior stakeholders at Google are not afraid of going deep into even Excel analysis.
Awesome. And then the second question is for Audrey from the same person, because you had experience, 4 years in McKinsey China, Greater China office, and also you just started in McKinsey Boston office just very recently. So any major difference that you can share with us, like working with same company, 2 different offices, kind of gauging the clients, customers, maybe additional culture difference can help us interpret.
Sure. I think culturally it's quite similar. At the end of the day, it's like one culture, one firm. I think the biggest difference that I noticed is the type of projects in China versus US. Because I think it's probably because of the fee structure in China versus US. It's way more expensive in China comparatively. If you compare hiring McKinsey versus hiring 10 extra people on your team, it's way more expensive in China. So then as a result, I think the projects in China, they're usually more high level, like it's more strategic, broader scope, versus I feel like, at least based on my experience in the US so far, it's less than 1 year, by the way, a lot of projects in US are way more kind of down to the ground and like detailed. You usually would work with a BU and to solve a specific business problem, compared to if you're at McKinsey China, there's a large chance you're working with reporting to a group of C-level clients, engaging very senior business leaders. So I think there's like pros and cons for each side. I think if you're interested in general just to learn about different industries, then I think working in Greater China probably gives you a better chance. And if you're interested in using consulting to learn some solid skills and transition to your next role, I think actually the US office offers projects that are like the context itself is much closer to an actual role in a lot of let's say tech companies or big corporates.
Okay, that makes sense. Next question comes from Wei Dong, and he's wondering, like, how do you practice before the presentation? Do you practice right in the mirror? Do you write down the scripts in advance and then try to memorize them? And also, or maybe just kind of try to remember the key bullet points, the key talking points. So how do you walk into the presentation room, walk into the conference room? Do you kind of use some kind of cheat sheet in your hands? So what are your technique?
I think I can get us started. I think I think I would usually write down a few bullet points for each slide, like the key points I want to get across, which I call like key talking points, and try to go through that before the meeting. And I think I've also seen, during my time at McKinsey, before the most important presentations, we would do a quick dry run where all of the team members representing get together and quickly run through the slide as if we were presenting.
Perfect. And then I think coming from the next question, this is from Chao Jiang. Sometimes providing a hand-waving type of answer on some very detailed technical question can help focus on the overall picture and divert the conversation back to business. Okay, well, that's just a comment on the experience side. Any other questions that you have? I think right now I have 5 minutes left, so feel free to either text in the chat, just type in your questions in the chat box, or just come up to the mic directly. Well, it looks like you guys did a good job on answering most questions throughout the presentations. Okay, so this is one from TA. Do you have any advice of delivering presentation effortlessly? Sometimes if we try too hard, the presentation style might come across as too formal. That's a very good one too, because I think people try to memorize for example, like if you walk into the interview and on the other side of interview, if you're interviewer and then your interviewee start talking fairly fluently, and then sounds like they memorize their self-introductions and they memorize certain answers to the questions, it might strike you as maybe over-prepared or maybe kind of too formal. And then how do you strike a balance there?
I can speak maybe just from my personal style. I was never capable of memorizing a long speech or long presentation. So what I usually do is I just ask myself if my audience can take away one thing or three things from my presentation, what would those three things be? And always just to remind myself during the presentation, sticking to those three things instead of memorizing the whole thing. I think that could help to kind of in terms of I would feel more like myself in speaking in that way, rather than just focusing on every bits of details that I need to deliver during the presentation.
Okay, awesome. And then we have two more questions just came up. I think one's a little less relevant to the, I guess the consulting background, but more of a, can you share how the MBA program at Wharton School add the value to you guys? As maybe, I don't know if you guys came from tech, but for someone who comes from tech, how does MBA program add value?
I would say that's a broad question. So before going into MBA, I didn't have a tech background. But I think just judging on people I know as part of the MBA program who did come from tech, I think it really depends on what they wanted to do after the MBA. What I have seen is that MBA enabled quite a few folks who were in tech to transition into other functions related to tech. I think at Wharton, given that we are heavily finance focused, I've seen quite a few people transition into investing in terms of tech venture capital and tech private equity. I've also seen folks I think product management has become a very hot topic these couple of days in MBA programs. I think some folks from the with tech backgrounds are using MBA as a stepping stone to transition into product related roles as well. Okay.
And then one of the last question, I think we should call it last question. It's already 11:30 now in the Pacific side. It's how do you convey technical concept in plain language to non-technical people? I think you touched on that already. Not sure if you have anything else to kind of add on to that.
I guess depends on how complex it is. Like another thing I could think of is just using analogy. Analogy to normal life, things people see every day that helps them to comprehend. Otherwise, I don't know, Jiaxi, if you have any other tips. I think usually it is a big challenge in every company, honestly. But like if we can just speak our normal daily language instead of technical one and try to put ourselves in the shoes of others to help them understand, then it's a process. But yeah.
I think another way to do this is to visualize these concepts. So for example, if you wanted to maybe explain a piece of code to a business stakeholder, I think instead of writing the code on the slide, you might want to synthesize it and put a flow chart on what the code does at each step, so that people can grasp it.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. I think also just from my personal experience, also working with the executive teams, it's always best to not use nomenclatures, don't use abbreviations, and try to really use simple concept to tell your story, or maybe kind of stay high level, don't go too much into the nitty gritty, and then help them understand what is the overall picture. And then the other thing is when it comes to any tech problems or when we try to capture opportunity sizing and such, always put a dollar amount, say, hey, this whatever project might sound pretty complicated, and here is the dollar value. And then this way you have something that can be easily transferable in their mindset. Okay, I think this is probably the last question we had. So again, really appreciate everyone's time. I think we'll call it, we'll do the meeting adjourned. And then really appreciate Jiaxi and Audrey for spending your, I guess, Saturday noon timeframe in the East Coast. I think both of you are still in Philadelphia right now. So, and also appreciate the audience for coming over from both coasts, from both East Coast and West Coast, and then, spending an hour, 30 minutes with us on Saturday. We will have more events in the coming months. So another Wharton grad, Susie, will be presenting us about their life, I guess some of her life lessons in the December, and then we'll have more of those information to be presented. So if you haven't done so, here's some contact information, or you can follow us on WeChat, follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram, and we'll have future events posted there. Again, this session is recorded, and it will take about a week for us to upload and also transcribe or do a text summary on the presentation itself, so that you guys will get another WeChat publications on the summary of this content, so you can use that for a review session if you wanted to. And the slides will also be shared. All right, thank you so much. And I think this will be it. Everyone have a good weekend.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Have a good one.
See you.